In 1999, the Japanese conglomerate Mitsubishi quietly shut down the Apricot computer brand, erasing a name that had once dominated the British business desk. 15 years earlier, Apricot was the largest supplier of personal computers to British businesses. They had beaten IBM on British soil, placing sleek, voice-recognizing machines with 3.5-inch microfloppy drives onto office desks before the rest of the world even knew the format existed. But when the brand was finally discontinued, there was no national outcry. Corporate buyers had long moved on, and British offices simply replaced their aging units with standard beige boxes. The paradox is that Apricot did not disappear because they built a bad computer. They disappeared because they built a better machine for a market that only wanted a standard one. The real story of Apricot is not just about a corporate shutdown. It is the story of a British company that tried to out-engineer the global IBM standard, only to discover that the world no longer cared about the hardware at all. Every week we document the forgotten British machines, software houses, and tech platforms that once taught the country what the future felt like. Subscribe if you believe this digital history deserves to be remembered. The story begins in a Birmingham office in the early 1980s, where one company decided to build the future of the British desk. Before they built the machine that would challenge IBM, Applied Computer Techniques was merely a company selling the future on behalf of others. Founded in 1965 in the West Midlands, ACT originally operated as a computer bureau. In an era when a computer was a mainframe the size of a room, requiring reinforced floors and dedicated cooling, most British businesses could not afford one. ACT sold computing power by the hour, processing payrolls and ledgers for local companies who lacked their own digital infrastructure. By the late 1970s, the market was shifting. The microcomputer, a machine small enough to fit on a desk, was moving from the university lab into the commercial world. Seeing the change, ACT pivoted. They bought a software house and acquired the exclusive British distribution rights for the Sirius One, an American business computer designed by Chuck Peddle, the engineer behind the Commodore PET. The Sirius One was a revelation. While British bedrooms were filling with Sinclair ZX81s and early BBC Micros, these home computers were mostly used for learning basic or playing games on a television set. The British business desk, however, remained largely analog, dominated by typewriters, filing cabinets, and carbon paper. The Sirius One offered a high-resolution screen, twin floppy disk drives, and a serious business demeanor. ACT sold it brilliantly, shifting thousands of units and establishing themselves as a trusted name in British IT supply. But distributing an American machine contained an inherent risk. ACT controlled the sales, but they did not control the supply chain, the hardware updates, or the underlying technology. If the American manufacturer stumbled, the British distributor would fall with them. In 1982, the leadership at ACT made a decision that would change the trajectory of British computing. They decided they no longer wanted to just sell a computer, they wanted to build one. The ambition was not merely to assemble a generic box of components. The IBM personal computer had launched in America the previous year, establishing a bulky beige standard that was slowly making its way across the Atlantic. ACT looked at the IBM PC and saw an opportunity. The IBM machine was heavily built, visually uninspiring, and took up a massive footprint on a desk. ACT believed that the British market, and specifically the British executive, would pay for something better. They wanted to create a business machine that did not look like industrial equipment. It had to be powerful enough to run serious spreadsheet and database software, but it also had to be an object of desire. They codenamed the project Apricot. The name was a deliberate, slightly cheeky nod to another fruit-themed computer company rising in California. But the machine they were designing was entirely focused on the British corporate environment. To build it, ACT set up a manufacturing base in Glenross, Scotland, tapping into the emerging Silicon Glen ecosystem, while design and engineering were driven from their headquarters in Edgbaston, Birmingham. The defining decision of the Apricot project was its architecture. The computer would run MS-DOS, the Microsoft operating system that was rapidly becoming the standard for 16-bit business computing. However, ACT chose not to make the Apricot 100% hardware compatible with the IBM PC. At the time, this did not seem like a fatal error. In 1982, the idea of a universal, rigid IBM standard was not yet absolute. Many manufacturers believed that as long as a machine ran the MS-DOS operating system, software could be easily adapted. By unshackling themselves from IBM's exact hardware blueprint, AX engineers were free to innovate. They could build a faster processor, integrate better graphics, and fundamentally rethink how a computer interacted with the person sitting in front of it. The physical design was outsourced to a British industrial design firm who created a sleek, low-profile central unit. But the most radical choice was the storage medium. The standard for business computing in the early 1980s was the 5.25-inch floppy disk, a flimsy, bendable square that was prone to damage from dust, coffee spills, or a heavy hand. While researching components, ACT executives traveled to Japan and saw a prototype of a new storage format developed by Sony, the 3.5-inch microfloppy. It was encased in hard plastic, had a metal shutter to protect the magnetic disk inside, and held just as much data as the larger, more fragile format. It was an unproven, expensive technology that no major Western computer manufacturer had yet adopted. ACT decided to build the entire Apricot PC around it. When the original Apricot PC launched in September 1983, it did not look like anything else on the market. It featured twin 3.5-inch disk drives, a high-resolution green phosphor monitor, and a keyboard that included an integrated LCD screen, a feature designed to display quick calculations or command shortcuts without interrupting the main display. It was priced at around $1,500, a significant investment, but perfectly pitched for the corporate buyer. The company had built a machine that felt like the future. Now they had to convince the British high street and corporate IT departments to put it on the desk. When the Apricot PC arrived on the British market in the autumn of 1983, it did not look like a machine designed for a back room or a dusty IT department. It looked like a machine built for the boardroom. Priced at $1,495, the system immediately stood out against the heavy, industrial aesthetic of American business computers. The IBM personal computer, which had launched in the United States 2 years earlier and was slowly establishing a foothold in Europe, was large, heavy, and undeniably beige. The Apricot, by contrast, was a low-profile, sleek, dark gray unit. It took up less space on a desk, and its separate monitor could be easily adjusted for glare. But the breakthrough of the Apricot PC was not merely cosmetic. It was a triumph of bundled utility and calculated hardware risks that perfectly matched the needs of the British corporate buyer. The most striking decision sat on the front of the machine. Instead of the wide slots required for the standard 5.25-inch floppy disk, a flimsy, flexible, magnetic storage format that was easily damaged by a careless hand or a spilled cup of tea, ACT had fully committed to the Sony 3.5-inch microfloppy. This new format was encased in rigid plastic with a sliding metal shutter that protected the data inside. To a modern observer, a 3.5-inch disk is the universal save icon. But in 1983, it was an exotic and unproven standard. By adopting it early, Apricot offered British businesses a more reliable, pocketable way to transfer spreadsheets and ledgers. An executive could slip an Apricot disk into a suit pocket without fear of bending it. It was a physical manifestation of a more refined computing experience. The keyboard, too, offered a feature that no other major manufacturer had attempted. Above the standard keys sat the microscreen, a two-line integrated liquid crystal display, LCD, built directly into the keyboard itself. This small screen was supported by a row of dynamic, touch-sensitive function keys. Depending on the software being used, the microscreen would display different labels for these keys, or it could function as a standalone calculator and calendar without interrupting the main monitor. In a British office environment where executives were still transitioning from typewriters and physical diaries, this interface provided a bridge. It made the computer feel like an intelligent desk tool rather than a complicated programming terminal. Underneath the plastic casing, ACT's engineers had built a machine that was objectively more capable than its primary American rival. The Apricot was powered by an Intel 8086 processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions. This processor was a true 16-bit component, making it significantly faster and more efficient than the slightly crippled Intel 8088 chip used in the IBM PC. As a result, the Apricot could calculate complex columns of numbers or refresh a screen of text with a speed that left the American standard feeling sluggish. Yet the most critical factor in the Apricot's breakthrough was not just the hardware itself, but how it was sold. ACT understood that a British small business owner, a high street solicitor, an accounting firm, or a regional logistics company did not want to buy a box of electronics and then spend weeks hunting for compatible software. They wanted a solution that worked the moment it was plugged into the mains. Therefore, every Apricot PC was bundled with a comprehensive suite of business software right out of the box. The machine came with SuperCalc, a powerful spreadsheet application, alongside SuperPlanner and the industry-standard WordStar word processor. By bundling thousands of pounds worth of software into the base price, ACT made the Apricot an irresistible proposition for local businesses and purchasing managers. The machine was not just a computer, it was an entire digital office in a single box. To run this software, the Apricot used MS-DOS, the core operating system, licensed from Microsoft, that manages the computer's basic functions and lets other programs run. This was the defining technical compromise of the Apricot ecosystem. ACT's engineers had chosen to run the industry-standard operating system, but they had written their own specific BIOS, the foundational code that links the software to the hardware. They did not make the Apricot a 100% hardware clone of the IBM PC. At the time of the breakthrough, this did not seem like a weakness. It seemed like a strategic advantage. In 1983 and 1984, the computing industry largely believed that as long as a machine ran MS-DOS, software developers would simply compile different versions of their programs for different computers. By not copying IBM's hardware architecture exactly, ACT was free to give the Apricot better high-resolution graphics and a faster processor. They believed that superior British engineering, combined with the Microsoft operating system, would be enough to win the desk. And for a brief, spectacular window, they were entirely right. The British computer trade press, including influential magazines like Personal Computer World, praised the machine's design, speed, and value. But more importantly, the corporate supply chain embraced it. ACT leveraged its extensive network of independent computer dealers across the United Kingdom. These dealers, who had previously made their margins selling the Sirius One, eagerly pushed the homegrown Apricot to their corporate clients. The strategy worked with astonishing speed. By 1984, ACT was selling thousands of units a month. The Apricot badge became a status symbol in the British business world, a sign that a company had invested in modern, sophisticated technology rather than settling for a generic, beige import. In the corporate sector of the United Kingdom, Apricot rapidly became the dominant 16-bit microcomputer, outselling IBM on British soil. The company had built a machine that perfectly understood the British office, and the market had rewarded them with an empire. But the very architectural choice that allowed them to build a superior machine was about to collide with a force that did not care about elegance. By the end of 1984, Apricot was no longer just a clever alternative to the American standard. It had become the definitive British business computer. The original Apricot PC had proven that a domestic company could outdesign IBM, and the market responded with a surge of capital. Applied Computer Techniques, AT, was not merely surviving in the shadow of American giants. It was actively beating them on British soil. In the corporate sector, Apricot became the largest supplier of personal computers in the United Kingdom. Their success was built on a deliberate strategy of rapid hardware iteration. ACT knew that to maintain their lead, they could not stand still. Shortly after the debut of the Apricot PC, they launched the Apricot She. Outwardly, it retained the same sleek, dark gray profile, but internally it replaced one of the floppy disk drives with a 10-megabyte hard drive, a storage device that keeps files, software, and operating systems even after power is off. In a modern context, 10 megabytes is a fraction of a single photograph, but in 1984, it was an ocean of data. A British accounting firm or a regional logistics company could now store their entire customer database, payroll software, and years of financial records inside the machine without ever needing to swap a fragile disk. In a British corporate office where digital transition was still a daunting unknown, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided whether a local firm felt intimidated by the future or in control of it, who mastered the rhythm of digital commerce, and who felt that British engineering could still command the executive desk. The Apricot became a genuine status symbol. While a standard IBM clone belonged in a back-office processing room, an Apricot belonged in the boardroom. The dark plastic casing, the sharp green phosphor display, and the integrated microscreen gave the machine an aura of executive privilege. It was distributed through a vast network of independent, high-street business dealers who proudly placed the Apricot badge in their shop windows, knowing it offered higher profit margins and a more compelling sales pitch than the beige boxes arriving from overseas. But ACT's ambition was not contained to the standard desktop. Buoyed by soaring revenues and a booming share price, the company's Birmingham-based engineers pushed their architectural freedom to its absolute limit. In late 1984, they unveiled two machines that demonstrated just how far ahead of the global market a British company could reach: the Apricot F1 and the Apricot Portable. The Apricot F1 was a striking, wedge-shaped computer designed to bring the brand's sophisticated business ecosystem to a slightly broader market, including small businesses and education. But it was the interface that caught the attention of the trade press. The F1 featured an infrared wireless keyboard, a system that transmitted keystrokes using invisible light rather than a physical cable. It also introduced a built-in trackball, an early alternative to the computer mouse that allowed users to navigate software without needing a completely clear desk. If the F1 was an experiment in accessibility, the Apricot Portable was an exercise in pure technological flex. Despite its name, the Portable was not a laptop in the modern sense. It was a luggable machine intended for executives who needed to move their work from a city office to a country home. But its feature set was astonishing. It included a high-contrast liquid crystal display, an integrated voice recognition system that could be trained to execute software commands via a microphone, and the same wireless infrared keyboard technology used in the F1. An executive could walk into a meeting, set the Apricot Portable on the table, use a wireless keyboard from across the room, and command the machine to open a spreadsheet using only their voice. In 1984, this was not just computing, it was science fiction made real by a British company. At this moment, ACT officially changed its name to Apricot Computers, aligning its entire corporate identity with the hardware that had made it a giant. They took out aggressive, full-page adverts in computing magazines and national newspapers, actively mocking the IBM PC as an outdated, slow, and unimaginative relic of the past. They had built the better machine, captured the British high street, and won the corporate desk. But the company's greatest strength, its willingness to forge its own architectural path, was about to collide with the brutal reality of the software market. By 1985, the momentum behind Apricot Computers was undeniable. The company was no longer just a regional player. It was a dominant force in the European business technology sector, employing thousands of people across its Birmingham headquarters and its manufacturing facility in Glenrothes, Scotland. The peak of Apricot's empire was built on an extensive network of over 500 specialist dealers across the United Kingdom. These were not generic high-street electronics stores. They were dedicated business computing specialists who understood how to configure a network, install supercalc spreadsheets, and train local office staff. For a regional accountancy firm in Manchester, a law practice in Bristol, or a manufacturing plant in Sheffield, buying an Apricot system meant having a local partner who would answer the phone and visit the office if a disk drive failed. This deep integration into the British professional landscape created a powerful sense of loyalty. The dark gray chassis of the Apricot PC and the subsequent SHE models were fixtures in hundreds of corporate boardrooms. In a British office where digital transition was still a daunting unknown, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided whether a local firm felt intimidated by the future or in control of it, who mastered the rhythm of digital commerce, and who felt that British engineering could still command the executive desk. The company's marketing mirrored this prestige. Full-page spreads in Personal Computer World and national newspapers contrasted the sleek, compact Apricot line with the bulky, unimaginative design of American machines. By positioning themselves as the sophisticated, high-performance alternative to IBM, Apricot captured a massive share of the UK corporate microcomputer market. Their annual turnover soared into tens of millions of pounds, and their share price on the London Stock Exchange reflected the soaring confidence of investors who believed Britain had finally built a computer giant capable of standing against the world. Yet beneath this glossy exterior of corporate success and technological ambition, the foundations of the empire were beginning to shift. The very strategy that had driven Apricot's rise, the decision to engineer a superior, proprietary architecture running MS-DOS rather than cloning the IBM PC byte for byte, was about to trap them. Across the Atlantic, software developers were no longer writing programs for individual, custom hardware configurations. They were writing directly to the IBM standard, baking the American machine's specific quirks, memory maps, and BIOS calls into their code. When a new, highly anticipated spreadsheet or database package was released by American software houses, it was designed to check for an IBM-compatible environment. When an executive tried to load that shiny new disk into an Apricot drive, the screen would often freeze, or a silent error code would flash across the monitor. The machine was too fast, too uniquely structured, and too independent to understand code written exclusively for a beige box. The small cracks were already forming in the architecture of success. But for a brief, brilliant window in the mid-1980s, the British business desk belonged entirely to Apricot. The first crack in the Apricot empire did not arrive with a dramatic corporate collapse or a sudden bankruptcy filing. It arrived as a silent, frustrating error message on a high-street solicitor's screen. By 1985, the American software market had reached a critical mass. Software houses in Silicon Valley and Boston were no longer writing programs that could be easily adapted to custom European hardware architectures. Instead, developers were writing code directly to the hardware specifications of the IBM personal computer, baking the American machine's specific memory maps, interrupt vectors, and BIOS routines straight into their software packages. When a regional accountancy firm in Leeds or a manufacturing plant in Sheffield purchased the latest, highly anticipated version of an American database or spreadsheet tool, they expected to unwrap the box, slip the disk into the drive, and begin working. But when that disk was inserted into an Apricot PC or G, the system often froze, or a cryptic system failure flashed across the green phosphor monitor. The machine was simply too fast, too uniquely structured, and too independent to understand code written exclusively for a generic beige box. This was the trap of Force 3: ecosystems and developer support. Apricot had built a superior machine, but they did not control the software library that gave a computer its actual utility. As American software developers standardized entirely around the IBM-compatible architecture, fewer companies bothered to compile custom versions for the Apricot operating environment. The consequences rippled quickly through the British high street dealer network. Independent business computer specialists, who had previously built their entire monthly revenue on selling Apricot systems alongside bundled software packages, began to face difficult questions from corporate buyers. Customers no longer wanted the machine with the best hardware specs or the sleekest dark gray chassis. They wanted the machine that could run every piece of software imported from the United States without hesitation. The market was shifting from proprietary excellence to standardized convenience. Across the Atlantic, a new wave of American manufacturers and aggressive Taiwanese suppliers were mass-producing IBM clones at a fraction of the cost. These machines were heavy, uninspired, and visually identical to the original IBM PC, but they possessed one overriding virtue: absolute, uncompromised compatibility with every single piece of software written for the standard market. Then came the domestic threat that proved even more lethal. In 1986, Alan Sugar's Amstrad launched the PC-1512, a low-cost, fully IBM-compatible personal computer priced at under $400, including a monitor. For a British small business owner or a local high street shop, the choice was suddenly stark. They could buy an expensive proprietary Apricot system that required specialized support, or they could buy an Amstrad that ran every standard American program straight out of the box for a quarter of the price. The Apricot brand, once a symbol of cutting-edge British executive prestige, found itself squeezed from both sides. High-end corporate buyers were migrating toward IBM and Compaq, while small businesses and regional firms were turning to budget clones. Apricot Computers recognized the danger, but their response came with a fatal delay. In an effort to stop the bleeding, the company abandoned its independent architectural path and began developing machines that were fully IBM compatible, culminating in systems like the Apricot Chi series. It was a necessary commercial pivot, but it stripped the company of its identity. When an Apricot computer looked, acted, and ran software exactly like an IBM clone, the primary reason to buy a British-engineered machine vanished. They were no longer out-designing the global standard. They were merely competing on price and distribution against global giants with infinitely deeper pockets. Manufacturing costs at their Glenrothes plant in Scotland began to outpace declining profit margins. Inventory sat unsold in regional warehouses across the United Kingdom as dealer orders slowed to a trickle. The company that had once commanded the British business desk was suddenly struggling to meet payroll and service its mounting debts. The empire was no longer expanding. It was fighting for survival on ground, chosen entirely by its competitors. The pivot to fully IBM-compatible machines, such as the Apricot Chi series, arrived too late to rescue the company's market position, and it fundamentally dismantled the reason for the brand's existence. When an Apricot computer looked, functioned, and ran software identically to a generic machine built in Taiwan or assembled in an American warehouse, the primary argument for buying a British-engineered system evaporated. Customers could no longer justify paying a premium for domestic design when the internal architecture was indistinguishable from every other beige box on the high street shelf. The financial reality of this transition was brutal. Apricot Computers had built its empire on higher margins, derived from proprietary hardware excellence and bundled business software suites. Stripped of that differentiation, they were forced into a bruising price war against global manufacturers with vastly superior economies of scale. The manufacturing plant in Glenrothes, Scotland, which had once hummed with the production of thousands of sleek, dark gray desktops and innovative portables, began to record heavy overhead costs as assembly lines slowed. Inventories of unsold components accumulated in regional warehouses across the United Kingdom, tying up capital while dealer orders dried to a trickle. Independent business computer specialists who had previously championed the Apricot badge across every major British town and city, quietly dropped the brand from their catalogs, turning their attention to cheaper, faster-moving imports that required less specialized explanation. By the end of the 1980s, the company was caught in a classic structural trap. The software ecosystem had migrated entirely to the American IBM standard. Corporate buyers were standardizing around multinational suppliers, and the high street retail landscape was undergoing a seismic shift towards volume-driven box shifters like Dixon's and PC World. The losses mounted into millions of pounds. The share price on the London Stock Exchange plunged, and the proud Birmingham-based firm found itself fighting for survival against mounting debts and vanishing credit lines. The rescue, when it came, signaled the end of the brand's independent British existence. In 1990, the Japanese industrial conglomerate Mitsubishi Corporation, which had maintained business ties with Apricot through component supply and distribution partnerships, stepped in to acquire the ailing company. The takeover provided the immediate capital injection required to keep the business solvent, but it permanently severed the link between the brand and its British manufacturing roots. Mitsubishi did not buy Apricot to continue manufacturing pioneering British microcomputers. They acquired the company to salvage its remaining corporate relationships, its service infrastructure, and its technical expertise in networking and server technology. The consumer-facing desktop line was systematically wound down. The brilliant design teams in Edgbaston and the assembly lines in Glenrothes were restructured, downsized, or absorbed into the Japanese giant's broader European operations. The name Apricot was quietly stripped of its personal computer identity and repurposed for a new corporate mandate, supplying high-end enterprise servers and heavy-duty IT infrastructure to large corporations and government departments. For a few more years, the Apricot logo could still be found printed on heavy, floor-standing server cabinets, tucked away in the locked basements of corporate office blocks across the United Kingdom. But these machines were indistinguishable from any other server built in Tokyo or Silicon Valley. The unique hardware architecture, the Sony 3.5-inch microfloppy innovation, the microscreen keyboard, and the bold ambition to outdesign the American standard were entirely gone. The brand had survived, but the empire had already fallen. The dealers closed their doors. The high street moved on. The software companies forgot the old architecture. The classrooms filled with beige boxes. The logo remained on a server rack. The habit behind it was already history. The company was no longer British, and the machine was no longer an Apricot. The brand simply waited in the dark for the final switch to be thrown. When Mitsubishi officially retired the Apricot name in 1999, there were no headlines in the national newspapers, no retrospectives on evening television, and no corporate farewells in the city. By then, the brand had long since ceased to manufacture the distinctive dark gray desktop computers that had once filled British corporate offices. The manufacturing plant in Glenross had closed its doors years earlier, its production lines dismantled or converted to other electronics. The vast network of independent business computer dealers that once stretched across every major British high street had vanished, replaced by national retail sheds and online warehousing. The Apricot name, which had once represented the absolute peak of British executive computing prestige, was quietly written off the books of a Japanese conglomerate that had grown weary of a subsidiary that no longer fit its global manufacturing strategy. Yet history rarely erases a technology entirely. It merely relocates it from the active office desk to the quiet shelves of archives and museums. Today, if you visit institutions like the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park or the Center for Computing History in Cambridge, you will find surviving examples of the Apricot PC, the She, and the Portable. These machines are preserved not merely as curiosities of a bygone era, but as physical documents of a critical crossroads in computing history. Their dark gray chassis, engineered with a level of industrial elegance that made American IBM clones look like heavy industrial machinery, stand as silent reminders of a time when British designers believed that aesthetic refinement and hardware innovation could overcome commercial standardization. The survival of these machines passes the ultimate test of historical relevance. They explain why modern computing looks the way it does. Apricot was right about the future of data storage long before the rest of the world caught up. When they committed their entire product line to the Sony 3.5-inch microfloppy disk in 1983, they anticipated the shift away from fragile, bendable magnetic media toward durable, portable storage formats that defined the late 1980s and 1990s. Their early experiments with infrared wireless keyboards, integrated microscreens, and voice recognition commands prefigured ergonomic and input developments that would take decades to become mainstream consumer expectations. The legacy of Apricot Computers is not one of technological failure, but of structural displacement. It demonstrates a permanent, uncomfortable truth about the technology industry. The best machine does not win the market. A company can build a faster processor, design a sleeker casing, bundle thousands of pounds worth of software, and secure the loyalty of hundreds of regional dealers, yet still find its empire dismantled if the underlying software ecosystem belongs to another continent. When software developers write exclusively for a global standard, proprietary excellence becomes an island, and isolation is fatal in a connected economy. There is a strange, quiet footnote to the company's collapse. Long after the hardware division was absorbed and the brand name retired, the underlying philosophy of British engineering, adapting advanced technology to practical, human environments, did not entirely vanish. The engineers who had worked in the design rooms in Birmingham and the assembly lines in Scotland dispersed into other sectors of British electronics, telecommunications, and software development, carrying with them the experience of what it meant to challenge the global standard and come remarkably close to winning. History often remembers the victors of platform wars. The companies that established the universal standard, captured the massive developer ecosystems, and populated the beige boxes of the world. But the losers of those wars leave behind something equally valuable: a record of ambition, ingenuity, and alternative paths not taken. Apricot proved that British engineering could build a machine that outdesigned, outcalculated, and outstyled the American corporate giant on home soil. That it was ultimately defeated not by superior engineering, but by the gravitational pull of a software standard, is the central tragedy of its existence. Somewhere in a British loft or a damp Birmingham garage, a dark gray Apricot PC still sits beneath a layer of undisturbed dust, its rigid 3.5-inch floppy drive empty, its green phosphor monitor cold, and its keyboard waiting for a hand that will never again switch it on to face the future. See you in the next one.